Back in the mid-1930s, the US Coast Guard faced a somewhat ironic problem. A country which had been founded, at least in part, as a result of rebellion against enforcement efforts against smugglers who didn't want to pay import taxes, was now looking to enact enforcement against smugglers who didn't want to pay import taxes. More specifically, the rise in the number of small, swift ships and boats able to traverse great distances under private ownership meant that the US Coast Guard's existing fleet was either too slow or too short range to keep up with some of the more adventurous smugglers. Thus, there was a need for a long-distance cutter capable of relatively high speeds, at least compared to civilian-owned craft, and to maximise efficiency and minimise overall costs in hulls, the new ship would also need to be able to carry an aircraft, since this would then be able to search and patrol quickly over a wide area and then direct the mothership towards anything suspicious. As the Erie-class gunboats were then under construction, this hull and machinery set was used as a starting point. After a great many options were considered, a final design was accepted that came in at around 2,300 tons with a top speed of 20 knots thanks to a pair of turbines that ran with just over 5,000 shaft horsepower. There was no armour to speak of, this was a Coast Guard ship after all, but they were a fairly heavily armed lot, with a pair of 5-inch 51 caliber guns mounted super-firing up front as aircraft facilities took up much of the stern, a pair of 6-pounders and a single 1-pounder. Known as the Treasury class, or the 327s, the former designation after their namesakes being former Secretaries of the Treasury, the latter for their length of 327 feet, 7 ships were ordered, and the last of them, the Taney, is today's main subject. Laid down in May 1935, launched in June 1936, and commissioned in October of the same year, the ship was at first known as the Roger B. Taney, although this was shortened to just Taney less than a year after her commissioning. Her first area of operation was the Pacific, supporting the claiming of various small islands, ostensibly as support bases for trans-Pacific Pan Am flying boats, and then serving as a supply ship for the people who are now living on those small islands. The fact that these islands afforded a certain degree of military advantage when it came to observing Japanese movements was neither here nor there, of course. But with tensions ever increasing, even US Coast Guard ships needed heavier firepower, and in 1940 she returned to the United States to swap out everything other than the 2 main guns, receiving in exchange 4 single 3-inch 50 caliber guns as well as depth charges. Operating partly alongside the US Navy on various patrols, December 7, 1941 found the Taney in Pearl Harbour, where she took shots at passing Japanese aircraft with her new 3-inch guns and a few 50 cal machine guns that someone had found and installed on the ship. With the more capable US Coast Guard cutters now in active service, including her, she was briefly used for anti-submarine warfare patrols before then spending most of 1942 supplying some of the small island colonies that she'd worked with pre-war and evacuating others. It basically depended on how close the Japanese advance was to that position. 1943 was spent ensuring the security of the Hawaiian Islands before she was sent to the Atlantic for yet another refit toward the end of the year, swapping out all her guns for no less than 4 single 5-inch 38s, more depth charge facilities, a Hedgehog launcher, and a number of 20mm Oerlikons. With all those upgrades slapped on, it's hardly surprising that she was soon on convoy escort duty, work which lasted until the tail end of 1944 when she was hauled in for refit yet again, this time turning her into an amphibious command ship, losing 2 of the 5-inch 38s, her anti-submarine warfare weaponry, and some of the 20mm in exchange for additional accommodations and communications facilities and half a dozen 40mm Bofors. Come the start of 1945, she was back in the Pacific, arriving off Okinawa in April, where she took up both command and coordination duties in line with her new refit, as well as helping to reduce the overall number of flying Japanese aircraft with her guns. After playing a little bit of Dodge the Typhoon towards the end of the Okinawa campaign, once World War II as a whole ended, she briefly helped in the occupation of Japan, before heading back to the US, where she was converted, once more, believe it or not, back into a US Coast Guard cutter, losing 1 of her 2 remaining 5-inch 38s and some of her anti-aircraft guns, but getting her anti-submarine weapons back in return. Then it was back to the Pacific, specifically California, where she would spend the next 15 years or so as a weather ship, sailing out to observe weather conditions and then reporting those conditions back to aid in forecasting, this being an era before weather satellites, long-distance weather radar, or long-term remote weather gathering buoys. She then spent most of the 1960s on general cutter patrol, with the occasional weather monitoring voyage thrown in, but she was drawn back into conflict briefly at the end of the decade when she was assigned to coast patrol and fire support missions off the Vietnamese coast. This assignment lasted most of 1969 and through into the start of 1970, before she reverted back to weather patrolling, moving over to the Atlantic for more weather patrols in 1972. But by the mid-1970s, the aforementioned weather buoys, satellites and long-range radars were really coming online, and so Taney shifted back to regular cutter patrols and search and rescue missions, including drug smuggling interdiction. She served in this role until late 1986, when she was finally decommissioned but headed straight into her new role as a museum ship in Baltimore in Maryland, where she remains to this day, having among other things served as a significant part of the early career of one Ryan Szymanski, before he went on to eventually become curator of the Battleship New Jersey Memorial and Museum.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.